Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is returning guest Wokal Distance, who's been on my channel 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times since we met back in 2020, or maybe even 2021. In this conversation, we tackle his critique of the so-called outer or dissident right and their stance with regard to ethno-nationalism and immigration, and I kind of step up a little bit and try to steelman this so-called alt-right or far-right position of people who want some formal sort of nationalism, and I don't know to what extent that nationalism needs to be based on ethnicity so much as a shared set of cultural values. Fascinating conversation. You can find Wokal via the links below. Without further ado, here is Wokal Distance. So, well, at least audio's not getting broken up, but your video's pretty potato.
Sorry about that. Let's add some light. Is that better? Is this an improvement? Because I'm using the same thing I always use.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's the same setup.
Okay. Cool. That's what's been going
How
on.
have you been, my friend?
Pretty good.
Things have been going well. I have been eagerly watching the discourse to see what has been happening, and I am intrigued by the various directions, although not surprised that of the directions that everything that used to be categorized as counter woke has moved. Commensurate with my view that we're living in a modern world, everything is fragmenting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how would it not?
That is indeed the question. How would it not? That's how would everything not fragment is the primary question, which is motivating the current conversation between Alex O'Connor, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, and various other people.
Okay.
The
know.
attempt to create something around which Western culture can reconsolidate itself in a way that doesn't endlessly fragment and fall to pieces, is the very question of the discourse, and the higher level question above that is the question of the meta crisis and the crisis of meaning. If that makes any sense at all.
I mean, I'm familiar with all those terms, but we're talking about 500, 600, 700 years of fragmentation.
Well, I don't know if it's been that long, but I mean, you could go back that far if you wanted to. I
Yeah.
wouldn't quibble.
Well, I mean,
But
the
I'm talking about
Reformation.
I'm talking about the acute crisis that's emerged in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years.
Okay.
I mean, things have been
We're
fragmenting for a long time. The proliferation of the denominations of Christianity have been showing how that could happen. But now we're not dealing with, cracks in the stained glass window. We're dealing with the stained glass window being we're not even it's not even splinters anymore. It's been ground to dust.
well, isn't that like a perfect situation to melt it all down into one unifying framework? And isn't that what the globalists or overlords are already hard at work at?
Yeah, that is kind of what's happening. Uh my own view of this is that at some point the social chaos is going to be too much for people, and it will be a battle over what will be the unifying principle, phenomena, organization, institution, social movement, etc. And there are people who are there are several groups that are several hermeneutical tribes which are preparing their own ideological agenda around which they want to everything to coalesce.
Yeah. Well,
And
isn't that the
and
problem?
yeah, and that's causing further fragmentation because those are bumping up to each other and then further dissolving and grounding and tearing up. So every movement has little slivers of counter movements, and um, this is creating a situation in which every movement spawns a counter movement, and then in the dialectical face-off between the two movements, further movements are splintered and formed, and there's nothing which pulls us upward to which we can aim. Right? If you had a high point to aim at, you could
Yeah.
aim, and then things would come together. It's like if there was a thing, I don't know what would we call that thing. Maybe a logos. That was a nice
Well,
term.
yeah,
That's a
but
term we
before
could bring
you,
back.
well, yeah, but people have to agree on what that is, and that's the problem, right? People
Do
seeing the
they
same
though?
thing in the same way. Yeah, it fractures because
Uh,
people disagree. That's the whole issue. People are disagreeing, and
uh,
with the marketplace of ideas and argumentation and rationality and declarative statements being the modus by which sense making is being made, then you're just going to have a lot of people just disagreeing.
I think that it isn't that. There's a disagreement about the logos. I think it's that we've ejected the logos from Western culture entirely. Disagreement about what the sun is does not stop it from shining and does not stop us from planting crops. If the sun were to be blotted out, that would be a problem. And so the logos has been blotted out from the discourse and from civilization generally. And for this reason, nothing grows. It's a desert.
I have a problem with that contentious. I mean, how could the sun like be effectively blocked? Is there a Bill Gates that's going and doing a bunch of cloud seeding to block our understanding? And isn't it the responsibility of individuals to connect and adhere to the light that shines upon them?
Um, I think that the ascendancy of postmodernism and the ascendancy of postmodern ideas, particularly about language and utter subjectivity, have simply rolled in like a fog. So it would be a thing. It's it isn't like I don't want people to think that the blocking out of the logos is like that Simpsons episode where Mr. Burns wants to blot out the sun.
Mm.
It's not a thing like that. It's that certain ideas begin to roll in like a fog and be accepted. They begin to become part of the culture, and as that fog thickens, each successive group doesn't realize that the fog is thickening, like the frogs in water. We're mixing so many metaphors at this point that I'm basically. But
I was going to bring up Frog Twitter, but yeah, go on.
well, they're the ones who are being not knowing by postmodernism. Much of the frog Twitter, much of the dissident right has accepted the premise that the woke are more correct than the mainstream, and then for have accepted the very thing which created or allowed the absurdities of wokeness. But we will get there later.
Okay.
Um, for right now, the important thing is that uh, those ideas have rolled in like a fog, and because they've been accepted, it's people's understanding, their language, their tools, and their just way of thinking and engaging about the world becomes less clear, becomes foggy, endlessly foggy, and the logos is thus blotted out. We're It's a sort of epistemic, normative, moral, and value nihilism that occurs. We've accepted. I'm going to put this. You see it a lot. Uh, you see it a lot in the fact that everyone always talks about the reasons why their views are being accepted rather than trying to argue about why their view is correct. So rather than saying my view is correct, what they say is, well, the other group doesn't accept my views because of systemic racism. They've been long housed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
So you have people talking about, um, what would you call it? Mm. So, for example, rather than having people argue about whether the Bible is true or not, or whether a certain proposition contained in the Bible is true or not, they'll instead say that the people who are disagreeing with me have accepted a certain form of hermeneutic that legitimizes their political ideology, so on and so forth. And then rather than talk about the substance of the claim and whether that substance of the claim is true, good, right, beautiful, et cetera, they instead try to deal with the machinations behind the claim or around the claim. They try to deal with the social milieu that gave rise to the claim or out of which the claim emerged. And so the substance of the claim gets ignored. And this is happening all over the place. And when you're always trying to get behind the thing, when you're always trying to get at the thing which is behind rational thought, what you end up doing is ignoring the substance of all claims and instead looking at something else. So you will look at the history of where the claim come from, or the social milieu out of which the claim emerged, or at the political aspirations of the people who make the claim, or at who benefits or whose interests are served, or the language in which the term was cashed out in, and you'll try and trace back how that language evolved and why that term or why that claim had to emerge given the linguistic tools in play, et cetera, et cetera. And what gets ignored is the substance of the claim, and this is going on in all directions. And when that happens, when the substance of all claims is eschewed in terms of some other transcendentalist thing, language, aesthetics, what Mike Dana calls the metaphysics of discourse, you end up with the situation as Karl Rapp points out in Fleeing the Universal, where rather than trying to engage with the substance of claim, everyone tries to dismiss everyone else's claims as the products of ideology or whatever. And when that's all going on, reason and rationality are disengaged in favor of a sort of cynicism. And once you do that, there is no way to get to the logos. The logos is blotted out because the logos is apprehended through the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? And rationality and the faculties of that nature. When you put those out in favor of a sort of hermeneutic of suspicion or a cynicism, or in trying to look at the other person's motives, who benefits, whose interests are served, what agenda is in play, et cetera, all the tools that you might use to apprehend the logos or understand the logos or get some understanding of the logos are no longer engaged. And this is the situation that we're in.
So can you do a worthy critique of the so-called dissident right without doing exactly what you're saying everybody else is doing? Saying that they're involved in some sort of hermeneutic of suspicion, and rather than engaging with their arguments on the true or the good or the beautiful, you say they're thinking at a lower level. And secondly, isn't that just a certain...
I'm stating what the critique is. I'm stating what the move is. I'm stating why it's invalid. It's invalid because it ignores the substance.
What would be the substance? Can we steel man before we deconstruct that? Just one, maybe the woman question,
sure.
Or longhouse ism or something.
So, I've been reading. Hold on, I have to get it.
You don't have to get it. Now I have to edit.
Do not need to edit any such thing. No editing is necessary.
Okay.
We can leave in the refocusing of the camera and me leaving.
It's not
of the viewership.
But that's okay.
This book.
We can't see anything.
The Universal by Karl Rapp is brilliant. And it's the critique of post-rational criticism. And so a number of people, I mean, this was brought up in the Thomas Acord thing, have attempted to coalesce around identity and power. You'll see this a lot in, let's find an example. The woke are more correct than the mainstream.
Who claims that?
Have you seen this?
Specifically, who claims that? And what does that mean?
Well, so here's Bethanon. Woke, more correct. Absolutely, from men of other tribes. The missing piece of that argument is that she can only nag the men of her own tribe. Men of other tribes are out of her reach and will simply ignore her nagging if they defeat the men of her tribe. So he's commenting on the meme, if men didn't exist, who would you? And the answer is supposed to be, protect us from who? And he says, woke more correct. Plagiarism is less egregious when the research was so regarded and insignificant to begin with. And he says, Charles says, it looks like GIF, J-op, I? Not sure. New woke more correct than mainstream just dropped. When the expectations regard for such research are already so low, plagiarism is indeed a lesser offense. One of the more rarely seen woke more correct strains, which are not supposed to exist to process criminals for prosecutors and courts to deal with, they're supposed to be invested with sufficient executive authority to keep order. Progressives stop that. So he continues on, he says, here's another guy. Heritage Americans is an interesting theoretical concept, but in the end, whiteness is what this all comes down to. Yes, white leftists are the leading haters of white people. And yes, non-whites can assimilate into whiteness. The woke are more correct on this. Once again, the woke are more correct. The woke are more
Well,
correct than the mainstreams that are.
can we evaluate those claims just based on what these people are trying to say, rather than them aligning with the
Right.
bad tribe of wokeness, and
Well,
they
I'm
themselves
not. I'm
being the
not.
bad tribe of not liberal?
I'm not trying to say that they're the bad tribe. What I'm
No,
pointing out is that there is a commonality in terms of the way that the thinking is done. It's the
which is
substance of the thought that is
which
the.
is which is what I mean. What's getting out there? There's certain patterns of human hierarchy. There's certain patterns of power. There's certain just there's evident, empirically verifiable ways that human beings operate, and calling that out and being aware of that, rather than supposing that everybody is a rational agent that's beholden to no time, place, heritability, alignment, tribe. Like we're
It's
post all of that.
the move that the dissident right makes, as near as I can tell, is to accept the premise that that knowledge and power are tied to identity in some important way. That there's a how can I put how can I say this? Um, there's a commonality. Thomas Acord actually stated this very succinctly. He said that critical race theory gets this right. He said different people from different races do have uh, different positionalities from which they can understand knowledge, and therefore they should be segregated in education.
Different positionalities, or different, generally speaking, different capabilities.
Positionalities is referring to, well, he might have been using it as a stalking horse for abilities, but I don't think so. I think he was talking about your social position and social conditioning allow you to have access to different forms of knowledge. This is the critical race theory argument, right? This is standpoint epistemology.
Well,
And Acord says,
isn't the
well, hold on a second. Let me
logos
finish.
that
Let me
he's
get the
championing?
argument out.
Okay, thank you.
Let me get the argument out. So, and he says, well, we accept that. He says we just take it in a different direction than the woke do, and say that that requires that we allow for different people to learn in different environments, and therefore students, white and black students, should be segregated. That was his argument, except for that he's a radical right winger. He's accepting the same move, and the answer is, of course, that that human beings are not, in fact, what would the term be?
Swap-outable cogs,
No, it's that
homogeneous agents.
your ability to have knowledge of certain things is not conditioned by your identity. That's not how knowledge works.
Well, at all,
Identities
or
are at all ever. It's just not how perception works. It's not how thinking works. It's not how rationality works.
well,
So
my
so let me let
okay.
so so here's an example. We can do this. My being a Canadian is an identity of mine. What knowledge is attendant to that identity? And the answer is
One
none.
Well, one hopes that you're informed about what Canada is doing and have an opinion on that.
My being a Canadian, uh, my Canadian citizenship, my identity as being a Canadian entails no knowledge of any kind.
Okay.
This is a
What?
mistake that gets made all the time. Identities are a proxy for what we might expect someone to know, but it's not. There is no metaphysical container there, or uh, or or identity is not in fact a constraint on knowledge or rationality at all. That's a mistake. It's at best a proxy. So you might say, well, of course he's Canadian. He could play hockey. He's Canadian. My being Canadian does not entail knowledge of hockey in any way at all. It's at
Okay.
best probabilistic that given the popularity of hockey in Canada and given that he is in Canada and lives there, there's a it should not surprise us that he can play hockey. But one does not entail the other. I'll give you another one. I knew a guy who was diagnosed with cancer. And going through a bunch of prep for the treatments that he was going to go through. There was going to be, I think, a couple of weeks of this. And so he's going and going and going and going through all of this prep. And as they're about to start I think it was chemo or something. I can't remember. As they were going to start, the doctor says, we're going to take another look at some other things. We want to just check some stuff, make sure. Turns out it was a misdiagnosis. Now, for 2 weeks, he would have said, I have cancer and I'm a cancer patient. And he took on what in cooperation and social justice, which is sitting right back over there, Joseph Heath calls the sick role. Takes on the identity of being a cancer patient in order to help him harden himself and prepare himself for what he thought was going to be a long and arduous battle with cancer. Turned out not to be the case. Does he know what it's like to be a cancer patient? Well, in some sense, maybe. Does he know what it's like to have cancer? No. Because the identity doesn't carry with it any inherent knowledge. And that's the mistake that always gets made. People are trying to the woke do it with a kind of modern social constructivist thing, and the alt-right tends to try and do it with some mixture of either race or ethnicity, but they're all attempting to try and ground somebody's being, knowledge, understanding of themselves, and what they're capable of in some sort of, what would you call it? In some kind of tribe, and say what you are, what you know, what kind of you can be is determined by, in some important sense, by your race, your ethnicity, or by your identity. And this is an enormous mistake. And it's the biggest mistake is made when they say that knowledge is attendant in some way to identity. And
Does this?
and this is the attempt here is they are what is the mistake that is being made? There's also a straw man that's being erected as well against liberalism, which is to state that liberalism thinks that people are all in some way replaceable Legos that can be swapped in and out willy-nilly for any reason at all. And liberalism doesn't think this. Liberalism is not, as some would say, the dissolution of all bonds not continuously chosen is not a tenet of liberalism. So there's several mistakes that are being made there. And the sort of acceptance of certain postmodern themes and ideas about knowledge and power is, I think, flawed. And the reason is because postmodern ideas, which I've critiqued endlessly on Twitter, are themselves flawed and wrong. And so if you accept those and you do your analysis with those, your conclusions are going to be fruit of the poisonous tree. Right? Does that make sense? Have I been clear?
If does this? Are there any identities that come included with knowledge or that are based on knowledge?
No, because I identity self-identification does not have any epistemic tools or properties to it. There isn't anything, how can I put it? There is nothing about any particular identity that carries with it a set, and you could conduct a thought experiment to demonstrate the point that it's all just proxies for other stuff. For example, if I was to decide right now that I would like to self-identify as literally anything, it wouldn't give me knowledge of that thing. I could say I self-identify as a German. I would not therefore speak German. I would not have knowledge of the city of Munich. I wouldn't know anything at all. Knowledge is a product. Generally speaking, all of the knowledge that we tend to debate is a product of perception and reason.
And identity has nothing to do with that.
Identity has no epistemic resources attendant to it.
What about a Christian identity?
The Christian identity is the product of knowledge, not the epistemic tool through which it's gotten.
Okay, so if identity is downstream from knowledge, then it's a valid identity.
Well, I don't know that it makes it valid, but identity is always downstream of knowledge. That is correct. Whether or not that makes it valid, I don't want to go that far because it's someone could come up with a case where you could form an invalid identity out of some true fact. That's, I guess, possible. So I don't want to go that far, but identity is downstream of knowledge.
So being a man comes with it a certain, I don't know to what extent. I can't know because it's so complex. And I've been a man for 47 years. So I don't know exactly how much me being a man has determined how I've been treated or how I see the world. But I do know that it does have something to do with how I am treated and how I see the world. And I pin a certain amount of value on the identity of man, such as being a gentleman, such as self-sacrifice, such as what could be called manly virtues. And tying those values and those virtues to my identity allows me to treat that identity as an ideal that I'm pursuing, and then an ideal that is submitted to something greater. Let's just say the good, the true, and the beautiful. The way that I wield
those virtues. Okay. I interrupted.
the way
I
that
apologize.
I'm trying to think through it. The way if I were to use my manhood to claim certain status or on its own give me some sort of inherent value, I think is false, but I don't think that the identity of male is completely without what you were calling epistemic substance. It's just the way that you use it.
It's not the identity of male that gives you any of that. It's those things that give you the identity of male. It's the opposite. So here's the point. Whether or not we have somebody who, for whatever reasons, let's say they were raised amongst all men and had no concept of female, for whatever reason, that would still have a lot of knowledge that we would assert with being a man, without having any identity rooted in being a man. So, for example, he would know what it feels like to get kicked in the nuts, presumably, which is something that you would only know if you were a man.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's the being of a man and not the identity, which is what matters in that case.
Okay. Is there
How
any
you
being?
identity?
Is there any being in German? Is there any being in Jewish? Is there any being in Anglo? Is there any being in
I'm not sure what you
European?
mean by is there any being? Is there any ontological entity? Is that what
Well,
you're
you said
asking?
that male has a being status. One is a male. One has certain drives, motivations, and then
Yeah,
experiences tied to that.
there is a, how do I put this? again, the the identity that you have, the thing that you identify as, or the act of your identifying as a certain thing, does not carry with it knowledge, doesn't grant you knowledge or not. If I stopped identifying as a man, I'd still have all the same knowledge that I have now.
Okay.
If I decided to identify as a woman or choose to identify as a woman, I would have all the same knowledge I have now.
In a political...
So there are no new epistemic tools or epistemic processes or epistemic methods. There is no, what would I use? What would be the right term? The identity, my self-identification doesn't do any epistemic work for me. My internal self-identity does not do any work at all. That's a mistake. And attempting to load people into certain tribal identities and then therefore split them up on that basis is also a mistake. Because it's an attempt to, and this was the conversation. Remember our conversation with Green Man, with Dave Green?
Mm-hmm.
And we kept going around on the issue of race. And the reason that we kept going around on the issue of race is because he wants the alt-right and the dissident right appear to want to belong to a tribe of like-minded people who are grounded in some sort of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
About which they can make, and then they want to use that as a way of making sense of the world. They want to ground some of their sense making in their peoplehood. I don't think he'd consider that to be a straw man.
Okay. Well, it depends, and I'd have to go back and I spent a lot of time editing that episode. Actually,
I'm trying to steel man him as much as he can.
So,
and you can have some empathy for it. There's a yearning there to belong to a group that is larger than yourself, to belong to a thing that is larger to yourself that you can both locate yourself in and contribute to. Something that you could. Community is a word that's floating in the neighborhood there.
Is community valid?
Sure.
Or is it only humanity is valid? You can have community.
Sure.
And
Sure.
to what degree can
a
community have particularity
nested.
before it abuts against this universalizing concept of logos and
nested.
humanity?
It's
nested.
It's
nested.
Right.
Okay. So what I remember specifically is Dave was saying that he doesn't have a problem with people freely associating according to whatever identity marker that they want. He doesn't personally think that those are important identity markers, though the male-female split would probably be a different way of looking at things. But he's not allergic, as they say, to people self-determining their own communities based on whatever they want. And the right has been, certain strains of the right are reacting to this woke pressure to assume all the guilt and have no agency based on their race, based on their sex.
That's correct. That is,
which has been going on for years and years and years and years and years. And so what would be the corrective to that? If not saying no, white people are not the worst ever. We're actually pretty cool. And we have our own interests, but that doesn't mean that we have to be murderous or fascist, but we just do have our own interest. And in a democracy, the only way for power to have feedback the only way for people to have feedback with the powers that be is to form coalitions, which is how
identity politics.
Well, yeah, it's to some degree politically identity is valent. Now, it's not truth, it is power. And I think that there's a reality to power, especially in mass society, that it's going to have particularity to it, and those particularities are going to glom on to different signifiers, including sex and including that hazy thing called race, and including religion
and this is
and
the
ethnicity.
identity politics. And the flawed assumption in all of this is that the interests are attendant to the identity. That there's
Come
something
again?
inherent in the identity that has its own interests.
Well, people have
That's the
interests, and
mistake.
identity is the vehicle to attaining the interest. Is that what
Ooh,
you're
I don't
pointing
know if
at?
I buy that either. Let's read some Searle because he answers this question beautifully. Talking exactly about this point. This change marks a dramatic, though little noticed, shift in the philosophy of higher education. Our ideal originally was to emphasize the individual within the universal. Now, neither the universal nor the individual is emphasized. Rather, you, as an individual, derive your identity not from your individual efforts at self definition, but rather from the group to which you belong. And, consequently, you are representative of your group. You cannot escape having identity through ethnicity, by the way. When radical students in Berkeley attacked my department because of its lack of representativeness, one of my colleagues pointed out that Professor Searle is Cherokee. I am indeed one very small part Cherokee. But then there was a debate. Why was he not counted before? Well, said my colleague in the pages of the student newspaper, Professor Searle prefers to be thought of as white. I find that ridiculous. Professor Searle does not want to be thought of in these categories at all. There is something slightly absurd about our conception of race. My department chairman hoped and prayed that I would list Cherokee as my ethnic identity for affirmative actions reasons. But such a concept of race is quite bizarre. Recently, there was a debate about whether Jefferson had an affair with his African American slave, Sally Hemings. A close look at the evidence reveals that she is a small part African American in a way that I am even smaller part Cherokee. Of her four grandparents, three were white. The point, however, is that race is one of the few notions that is really a social construct in this country because you are defined by that which you or other people suppose can be most hated about you. And if you are one small fragment Cherokee or African American, then you count as Cherokee, African American, or whatever. Anyway, I disappointed all hands by refusing to insist on my Cherokee identity. This concept of group representation might seem perfectly clear on its face, but even it is subject to an application that reveals inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And so I think he's exactly correct that there's something extremely flawed. What's happened is that people have taken a thing, namely uh, a racial series of racial categorizations and racial realities that were created as a result of things that went on at the foundation of the United States, and have constructed an entire identity around that, and now are continuing on with that identity, even though the situation in response to which that identity was constructed is no longer attendant to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of all of these identities which they're trying to go back to continue on pure social inertia, divorced from anything that might have held them together. So, for example, um, my interests are far more aligned, for example, with my Hispanic neighbors, with the black people who live down the road, than they are
Yeah.
with white people, say, in Germany or Quebec, for that matter. It makes very little sense for me to adopt the identity white because it's at best just a descriptor of the skin color I happen to hold, and I have been informed by many members of the dissident right that I'm not in fact white, that I am Jewish in spite of my conversion to Christianity. And so part of my reticence from all of this is that I am now under the very odd situation where, in spite of my skin color, I am not white, and in spite of my Christianity, I'm still Jewish. And all of this seems to me to be a series of absurdities and mistakes made around
Mm.
holding on to identities which were or identity categories or tribal categories more accurately, which were created to deal with certain problems which are no longer the case. That being said, what the dissident right is trying to touch on is not entirely wrong or unreasonable. If you dig through what they're trying to do, they do have a point about some things. And you can't just dismiss that by pointing out that they've accepted certain tenets of postmodernism. The underlying concerns can still be valid.
So, what are they getting right? Can't see it.
It's Cooperation and Social Justice by Joseph Heath, one of the great
Okay.
volumes of our time. Let us read. Please turn in your Joseph Heath books. Please turn in your hymnal. To the essay, A Unified Theory of Border Control and Reasonable Accommodation. What Heath does in this wonderful essay is deal with many of the problems, goals, ideas, and concerns of people who are worried about immigration, including people like me, but without appealing to any of the identitarian ideologies or constructs that are attendant to, or I see as being attendant to, outright discourse or dissident discourse. So, when open borders advocates talk about movement, some of these theorists, I note, accept somewhat misleading characterization of the issue as one of movement. When we talk about freedom of, this is a description that applies more readily to tourists than immigrants. When we talk about movement or freedom of movement, it is not really a demand for movement that we are concerned with. This could be satisfied by issuing travel visas, but rather a demand for inclusion or the right to become a member of an economic or political society. This is the demand for this. It is the demand for inclusion in the labor market in the society that is particularly contentious. Apart from reframing the decision so that the right in question no longer sounds like it could be a negative liberty, this way of presenting the issue also makes it seem much easier to override. There are, after all, many forms of human association in which members are not obliged to accept anyone who comes along and demands admission. His point there is correctly that when someone says, I want to move to your country, it's not merely a matter of them deciding where they want to go or where they want to be. It's not a matter of physical location. They're asking to be joined, to join a society. And guess what? Since we have a society, and since we have an interest in perpetuating our society, we're allowed to have conditions under which we admit membership and which we don't. And so Heath's idea is this when he's talking about immigration, okay, and the sheer volume of immigration. My central idea, stated roughly, is that immigrants are at risk of acting in a collectively self-defeating way by disrupting or seeking to change the very institutions that account for the desirable properties of the societies that they are seeking to join. In order to avoid this outcome, states must have an immigration policy which must include both a system of border control and an active approach to immigrant immigration. And they should reject demands for accommodation in cases where these demands impinge upon core liberal principles. Okay? So what he's saying is, he talks about in this chapter about how liberals are often you see this also from the kind of dissident right, that the liberal has no way to defend his own liberalism. He has to tolerate everything and therefore can't defend himself. And Heath describes that as the liberal being a man who can't pick his own side in a fight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's continue on now. I think the greatest problem with the open borders view is it creates the impression that states can discharge an duty of justice simply by throwing open borders, allowing for free movement of people. Again, the metaphor of movement is misleading. What immigrants want is not to live within the territory of another state. They want to become members of the society and share its benefits and burdens. Right? Again. So, moving along, getting to the meat of it. There is, however, a tendency in the literature to treat racism from members of the majority nation as the sole problem faced by immigrants, and to regard all other problems within these communities as a consequence of the marginalization generated by racism. This diagnosis is based on a confusion of the normative and empirical claims being driven largely by a desire to hold immigrants themselves blameless for whatever misfortunes befall them. The issue of blame and responsibility is, in my view, entirely orthogonal to the empirical questions of how immigrant integration works, what the challenges are, and the extent to which immigration exclusion is responsible, and to the extent to which exclusion is responsible for the marginalization of certain groups. Even under ideal circumstances, migration has the potential to be hugely disruptive simply because of how human culture and social institutions work, and the extent to which modern societies rely very heavily on intensive socialization practices to achieve conformity with their institutional demands. Indeed, the generalized aversion to coercion in successful societies increases the relative importance of appropriate intrinsic motivation and thus of socialization practices, which serves as a significant barrier to the successful integration of immigrants who have been socialized elsewhere. Even if open borders did not generate an overwhelming influx of immigrants, the mere fact that the process is uncontrolled can create unpredictable migration flows, which would in turn make the planning of integration services particularly difficult. Okay? So far,
Mm-hmm.
he's not saying anything about ethnicities or anything else. He's dealing with the problems of social cohesion on purely liberal grounds.
Well, yeah, but the one strain of argument about core liberal principles is that they arose within a particular time and place and were modeled on certain assumptions inherent to a particular culture at a particular time. With,
Yeah.
I don't know to what degree it is or is not significant, a particular demographic makeup as well.
Okay. So we're gonna get two more things, and I'm gonna touch on that. Okay.
Okay.
People always get mad at me when I read stuff. They say, "Why are you reading it?" Because if I just say it, you'll say, "What's the source?" And then I give the source. Why'd you read it? Well, because okay, I'll just say it. What's the source? Fast forward it, man. It's YouTube. You can click the fast forward. Okay. Furthermore, the discussion. Now, this is another thing where the alt-right, again, has an underlying concern, which is legitimate, but I think cashes out wrongly. The discussion should be informed by the recognition that the consequences of failure in immigration integration can be quite malign. In the worst case scenario, it may be the result in the creation of a permanent underclass of marginalized, alienated, and resentful quasi-citizens. Illegal immigration in the States, anyone? This outcome is in no one's interest. Further, these problems risk becoming worse as the accumulation of grievances and the hardening of attitudes on all sides make the possibility of successful integration increasingly remote. No plausible conception of social or distributive justice can afford to overlook these possible consequences or fail to support policies such as immigration intake planning, that are aimed at avoiding them. Yet these policies all presuppose a system of border control. So he goes on to talk about that, and then he kind of hits the concern, which I think the alt-rightists are dealing with en masse, and which dissidents and which immigration skeptics have a problem with. It has become too easy to dismiss all resistance to migration as merely an effect of racism. This tendency is particularly pronounced among academics and other elites whose job security is seldom threatened by migrants and for whom major welfare impact of multiculturalism is that the quality of restaurants improved. By contrast, it is important to recognize that beyond merely economic effects of migration, shared culture is an important source of positive network externalities. Individuals derive real and significant benefits from living and working in proximity to others who share their culture, language, and religion. This is precisely why one sees residential clustering in ethnic communities. The situation with members of the majority culture is just the same as that with the minority. A difference is that the majority culture is normally just assumed to be secure. This, however, is not necessarily the case. And Dave brings up the same example, or Dave brought up the same example here, Vancouver. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver have seen the dominant cultural group transform from being an overwhelming majority to being less than half the population within a generation. Within specific residential neighborhoods, the effects are even more dramatic. When the number of Christians in a neighborhood declines to the point where local churches are shuttered, this has a tangible effect on the welfare of local Christians, completely independent of whatever resentment they may feel toward the thriving new mosque or temple which is constructed. Most club goods can be provided only when the number of members exceeds a certain threshold, and so if individuals want to consume them locally, they must take an interest in the consumption preference of their neighbors. There is nothing invidious about this. Ezra Klein has argued that there should be a morally neutral term, such as demographic anxiety, to describe the concern that individuals may have about the effects of shifting demographics. Yeah. Right?
Any
Migration.
term, any term is going to be automatically assigned a moral and
That's
bigoted weight.
right.
So,
That's right.
so you can't even talk about
Migration
this problem. So the
Migration
dissonant
policy
right,
should take into consideration the legitimate concerns that individuals may have under this heading.
yeah,
There are certain cases in which this demographic anxiety has been explicitly articulated and factored into migration policy. For instance, while French Canadians are a national minority group within Canada, with respect to immigrants, they form the majority group in the province of Quebec. As a minority group, their language is threatened externally by English society, and thus they are widely understood to have legitimate demographic anxieties. This is why we have language laws in Quebec protecting French language and culture. This already exists.
yep. But you wouldn't that would be okay for Quebecois, but that wouldn't be okay for I don't know, fifth generation European immigrants to the Americas.
Large-scale immigration, however, threatens to further undermine their language internally because immigrants to Quebec might choose to learn the language of the national majority rather than the local majority. Thus, Canada has faced the challenge of integrating immigrants not just into society, but into the society of internal minority in a way that is acceptable to that minority. As a result, the only way that it has been possible to have anything resembling a national immigration policy has been to offer a set of very explicit protections for Quebec, and in particular for the French language, in order to address these demographic anxieties. Again, none of this is, and Heath goes through all of this, and all of this is taken through a framework of liberalism. This whole thing, his entire essay, is done explicitly through liberalism.
Yeah, but why is it the case that, let's just say, whites expressing demographic anxiety in America is construed as alt-right or inherently bigoted and racist? Even it seems to be the case, even your critique of them rallying around an identity is a misstep, because they should only ever rally around a universal logo humanist
Oh,
ideal.
I didn't say that. I didn't say
Okay,
that.
but I'm just saying it like it's kind of
What I'm
implied.
suggesting is no. See, I so the Quebecois is not merely is not a racial identity. It's a cultural linguistic identity. I have far less of an issue. How can I say this? I think that, well, for one, let's do this. Have you ever heard of gentrification?
Yep.
The entire gentrification discourse. Do you remember? And you could see this in the popular culture. In on, do you remember the kid who went out and complained that there was no grocery stores in New York?
Yeah, or bodegas. What's up with it was
Yeah,
bodega,
yeah,
bro.
the bodega discourses, and instantly all the progressive leftists became ethno-nationalists overnight. How dare you, you white male, coming into here and f***ing our bodegas? This is our way of doing things here. Bodegas are a
Yeah.
cultural institute, right? Just
Yeah.
instantly, like AOC is an ethno-nationalist overnight. Okay,
Yeah.
because there are, and he's right about club goods. Things like bodegas, or your local car club, or your local church, which depend on economy, something like an economy of scale. That's not right, the term. Certain sort of density of people who share that commonality within the population in order to get off the ground. You've
Yeah.
got to have a certain number of Christians around before you can have a church. You've got to have enough Muslims around before you can have a halal meat shop that's profitable,
Yeah.
right?
But why is
worry about the loss
European
of- About
identity
the loss of such things is not, well, part of
the
it
one that has
is,
to stand by? We have to
well,
have demographic anxiety about their demographic anxiety, which
Ah.
just increases the anxiety all the way around. There's another
think-
aspect of discourse called
think-
noticing, and yes, it does have racial.
yes. And this is the point, is that I strongly, do you remember when Richard Spencer was like getting on CNN and was making this quasi sort of appeal to a benign white racial identity that could stand
Hmm.
alongside other identities.
Yeah.
And then there was a tape that was leaked of him screaming, and you might want to include that here. You could edit it in or not, where he used the term. Oh, I don't know if this will get us censored. You might want to enter this turnout. He used the term octoroon to describe somebody. Now I didn't know what that was, so I actually had to look it up, and it turns out that it's a sort of a racial slur of a certain sort. So you might need to, I don't know if Google or YouTube will catch that. But he said, "You little racial slur,
Hmm.
you are beneath me, and you look up and see a face like mine looking down at yours." And I think there is um, a sense in which many people are concerned that people like Richard Spencer are dressing up their racial superiority complex as demographic anxieties, which are legitimate.
Well, I mean,
Because Richard Spencer sung that song, right? Richard
well,
Spencer went off and played off like he was just concerned about which way is the arrow pointing. We're losing our ability to have our culture. He was talking about many things which sounded similar to what Heath was saying, but Spencer has a very, very different view of what he actually wants. And um, I think that uh, what he says is true, that it has become easy in the wake of the sort of Richard Spencer uh, blow up, and in the wake of things like that, to take everything that is um what would you say,
white demographic anxiety.
and construe that as just white supremacy in disguise.
Yeah.
This is the unmasking of everything, right?
Yeah, this is the
Rather than
trap that
saying,
was laid already. But you can
yeah,
be that way as long as you're in line with the leftist principles. You can praise George Floyd and made an idol out of him, and
yep,
construe all black people as basically hoodlums that need societal support rather than, you know, kind of drawing a line in the sand when it comes to criminality.
yes. And so there is there are some real concerns that have been picked up by the dissident right. The problem is that they carry along with it a sort of um
A stain of dog whistles, an
it's not
association
just
with unsavory ideas,
it's more than that. It is um
chauvinism.
many of them continue to seek a sort of racial and ethnic separatism for its own sake. They believe that it's the natural order of things for the races to be separate. And those people, um, Kinnists would be a good example of this, sing the very similar or use the language of and both the arguments that Heath lays out in his book. And it's entirely, and they do so to try and advance the Overton window in their direction. Um, and they also have accepted, as I pointed out earlier, a number of ideas from postmodernism relating identity and power, which I would take me a while to to go and catalog, but I could
Yeah,
do
we
it.
don't have to retread there, but I
No,
mean,
but and
there's
so my
identity and knowledge, and then identity and power, and I think we can agree that in a demographic or democratic landscape, power does intersect with identity, because identity is coalition building, and power needs to be run through coalitions in order to affect itself. Unless
uh
you,
I
go
No,
to a different
interests
kind of.
are connected to power.
Yeah.
Identity is the proxy for interests.
Yeah. Okay.
And what the mistake is being made is to take the racial identity and then assert that on behalf of the racial identity that certain interests ought to be adopted as the object of activism and advocacy.
But
In
they
other
are,
words,
regardless. They're
identity.
being done in the name of all the other groups, regardless of whether this
Yes,
one specific group can do that or not.
yes, I definitely think there's an enormous pile of hypocrisy, and I am against the identity
Well,
politics of the leftists as well.
yeah, but
I
that's the
think all of the
landscape.
racial. Right. And my concern is that the law, it doesn't have to be. That's what I was talking about before. It's the landscape because the social inertia of those identities just keeps going, but it doesn't need to. Like you'll notice that Spartan isn't an identity that anyone adopts anymore.
Well, they had their
You know
run.
that in you know why Antonin Scalia was nominated to the Supreme Court? Because he was an Italian. Italian identity politics was a thing. So the Italian vote was a thing. That was something that was actually you had to go get. But people no longer identify as Italians. And I am not trying, and what I would like for people to do is abandon the racial identification entirely in favor, and this is where they get mad at me, in favor of the creedal identifications.
Creedal.
Yeah, there are creeds.
So you want religious wars, not race wars. That's what you're angling for.
No, I don't think so.
Thanks for the honesty.
I don't think so. I'm not seeking for either race wars or any wars at all. What I am saying is that a liberal constitution did arise and liberalism did arise at a particular time and place. But the fact that it arose at a particular time and place does not imply that the principles involved are subjective. Euclidean geometry was discovered at a particular time and place. That doesn't mean that Euclidean geometry only attends at a certain culture. That's
at the risk.
Gravity was discovered at a time and place and is not therefore to a time or place. That's a mistake.
This is a problematic counterpoint, and I realize that, but this is, just to evoke the exposure I've had to so-called dissident right ideas. Can the liberal constitution apply equally or be enacted equally in Haiti and in Sweden? So this isn't Euclidean geometry. This is liberal principles.
That's the wrong. The is formulated wrongly.
Okay. But it's not universal like Euclidean geometry is. Or is it? Or it should be. And then who enforces that?
Again, the U.S. Constitution is not liberalism. The Canadian Constitution, Canada's democracy, is very different from American Republican democracy. And the British
How's that working out for you?
And the British Constitution is different from both of those. And the German one is different from those, but they're all liberal. So there are a number of different forms that liberalism can take. It's a mistake to universalize the American Constitution and say this is the appropriate Constitution for all times and all places forever.
Yeah. Well, is it not true that liberalism doesn't necessarily apply to China or the Middle East? Bringing democracy to the Middle East hasn't exactly worked out as we were promised.
This is to mistake what the truth of principles for their acceptance.
Okay.
The can be true, but if people accept it, then the Constitution does not hold. Right?
Yeah, just like our current government doesn't accept our Constitution, so it doesn't really
Yeah, someone once asked me what I thought about the American Constitution. I said, well, we should try following it since we've tried everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, implementing it is worth a shot.
Well, yeah, but like the fact that it hasn't really been implemented other than at very small
The,
scale, but not by the
not,
government itself, says something about power and the nature of liberalism when facing power, and the nature of the quote that you just said that a liberal is a man who can't take his own position in an argument.
that's
But the government
true.
will
A
always
lot of
take its own position in the argument, and it'll adopt your position as long as it forwards the government's interest. Now, the white racial identity is
Ooh,
counter to the government's interest at this point in time.
I don't know because that reduces everything to interests, and politics is not about just interest; it's also about truth. And when the government strays too far from truth,
Well, this is an old.
governments have strayed too far from truth, have collapsed. Andrei
Yeah.
Sakharov, who was the person who brought about, who gave the bomb, who created the Tsar Bomba. I believe it was called the Tsar Bomba. It was
The big one.
that was the big one, but he'd made the very first one.
Hmm.
And he said, I used to think the bomb was the most powerful weapon in the world. That's why I gave it to my people. But now I realize it is not the most powerful weapon in the world. The most powerful weapon in the world is not the bomb. It's the truth. What brought down the Soviets was the truth.
Yeah.
What's currently cracking China is the truth. What's currently cracking the current American government is the truth. And so while everyone else is focused on power, I'm focused on truth.
Okay. Yeah,
Truth-
but
Truth is
there's certain
the,
truths, or at least patterns, that are
can be used to
problematic that only
twist
the right
fabric
wing
of the
dissident of.
power can be used to twist the fabric of reality, but that fabric is going to snap back.
Yeah.
And so,
I agree.
um, it's the question is not, are the principles true? The question is, are people accepting them? That's a separate question. If people don't accept them, then will the Constitution work? Well, if people don't accept it, then no. I mean, this is why they're the political right who says, look, if the rule brought you to this point, what good was the rule? And my answer to them, dude, was the Christian culture, were we ever a Christian culture? Yes. Well, if the Christian culture brought you to this point, what good is your Christianity?
That's what some would say.
Yeah,
Others
and I
would say
throw it right.
people stray
I like
from that.
I toss it right back to them.
Yeah.
They're like, well, they didn't follow the Constitution. What makes you think they'll follow yours? And this is the whole point, right? Is that they say, well, we'll just have power, okay? And what makes you think that the people who get into power in the name of dissident rightism will continue on with dissident rightism?
Mm-hmm.
Because the people who were in the name of the Constitution got elected and put the Constitution in, and now they're not following it.
Mm-hmm.
So the solution that they have is no solution at all. And the reason that
maybe not. It depends on what you're talking about, because again, the dissident right is just that which is explicitly against the left, and a lot of them are trying to make smaller communities and saying, you know what, the structure is too big to stop, and eventually it'll crumble. But for the time being, we have to band together with like-minded people, i.e. or e.g. Creedal formations, and some of those
Balkanizing
creeds just accept that they have been balkanized already. Be honest with power. Being honest with power, isn't that truth? Speaking truth to power is just say, okay, this is how power operates. I'm not going to pretend it operates any way else in this time and place, and then going about protecting your own interests.
Okay, but now that's going against themselves because now they're universally. This is how, really, in all times, in all places, for all people. Really? There's a universal way that power works?
Well, I mean, power corrupts, doesn't it?
Does it, though?
I don't know.
God is all powerful. Has he corrupted?
I tend to mess up when I have power, but that doesn't keep me from avoiding responsibility, so I might as well have both.
My point is that by focusing on power and how power can be used and how power can be wielded and making that the central object and turning your eye away from truth, you create problems. A clear-eyed analysis would show that the problem with the United States is that the Constitution is not the problem. The problem is that people didn't follow it. And they say, well, if people aren't following it, your interests are aligned against your institution. But they don't need to be. And they weren't always.
Mm. I don't know. You'd have to go through and make an argument because I know certain people make
Sure,
arguments that it's never
sure,
been what it's purported to be. I mean, because power is
sure.
power is power is power is power is power is power.
They think it's this sort of analysis of the tribal interests are the things that are really driving everything, and you'd better hope that's not true.
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter. I don't think that tribal interests are necessarily bad. They tend to have friction when the tribes aren't trading among each other, but demanding that one tribe cede all of its isness in order for another tribe to manipulate all the other tribes in its favor, like
Yeah, and
it's the triumph of white guilt as the real racial
yes,
superiority held by the left.
it's
And
the
the
one. Yes,
dissident right is
yes.
saying we're not going to be manipulated by white guilt anymore. And actually, we should have a certain amount of agency and political capital that is tied to our
Qua
common
whiteness
heritage. Yeah,
to our
whiteness,
qua
whatever that
whiteness.
is. Yeah.
This is again it is. But my point is, I think that a lot of those people that even if the left wasn't doing that, would want to adopt white identity politics for its own sake.
Well, yeah, but a lot of those people isn't that's the I don't
Now that
understand that
doesn't
as a
delegitimize it
yeah.
doesn't delegitimize the overall point. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that.
So,
What I
so
am
I mean,
saying is that
we have to
the correct move is not to adopt white identity politics. The correct move is to the racial identity politics of the left. That's the correct move.
yeah, but do you understand that there's a thing called Civil Rights Act? I mean, I just interviewed Jeremy Carl, who's been a long time in government and public policy, worked under the Trump
The
administration,
problem is
been
not
at
the Civil Rights Act. The problem
Yale,
is the disparate impact
Harvard,
doctrine.
and he just wrote a book that details called The Unprotected Class, and it details at length targeted anti-white systemic racism. Now, one commenter said, "Oh, these privileged men whining about racism," that's the left talking. And then, but when I interviewed him, he was not about racial superiority. He was about racial
Right.
interest, and we need to grow a pair of balls and say, no, we're not going to be treated this way, and align with other ethnic groups in order to keep at bay through a balance of powers, a balance of tribes, this institution that is, even though it's run by people who are just on the left of us, but genomically very similar to us, this system is trying to tear us apart.
So I'm going to read some more Searle. Searle's my favorite philosopher, obviously, and
Obviously.
deservedly so because he's amazing. But I mean, what Jeremy Carl's talking about now, Searle was writing about like 30 years ago. The dissident right has this line, I think it comes from Oron McIntyre, that says every once in a while the left stumbles across
Yeah.
some ancient bit
Conservative
of wisdom and
values.
acts like,
Yeah.
and then they discover every once in a while the political left re-engineers conservative values and acts like they've discovered Atlantis. I'd like
Yeah.
to say that the dissident right recently has been stumbling across stuff that Searle pointed out 30 years ago and is acting like they've discovered Atlantis. So let's read some Searle.
But
Yay.
Searle. So just to comment on Searle, because you've read a lot of him in our discussions.
I should read
It
more.
seems like he's advancing a gentleman's agreement. But at a certain point, the gentleman's agreement, it edges into a duel and says, no, you cannot treat me this way, and I will exert my right of agency and autonomy to not be treated this way anymore. But like appealing to the better angels of our nature hasn't been a winning strategy for the liberals since Searle's time.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but let's read the Searle first. I do not have to tell you there is no way you can discriminate in favor of one group without discriminating against another group. So what I had feared, namely that there would be discrimination against whites in general and white males in particular, was exactly what happened. This is 99, by the way.
Yeah.
But something I did not predict was this. There was also discrimination against Asians. Remember the Harvard Asian case?
Yep.
This revealed the very interesting thing in undergraduate admissions. The leaders of Asian communities in California complained bitterly about discrimination against Asians in university admissions, and the chancellor of the Berkeley campus felt forced to apologize publicly to the Asian leaders. What this revealed to me, among other things, was that there was one group in the United States to whom you can do just about anything and they do not complain, and that is middle-class whites. They were the ones being primarily discriminated against, but the chancellor had no apologies for them.
Yeah.
By the way, the distortion produced by affirmative action had a very peculiar and unintended consequence. When it was admissions in the University of California, we in effect created two universities. One was a super elite university of people who were admitted on more rigorous and competitive standards than we ever had. The second university, acquiring its own departments with its own programs of study, was admitted on affirmative action criteria. The people who got wiped out were the members of the Joe College subculture. It might be that the day of affirmative action is coming to an end, but I will say in one sentence what is wrong with it. It is unjust. Why does not anybody make this simple point? It is simply unjust to tell people that you are invited to compete and then not judge the competition on fair criteria. And the outrage is compounded when we are told that this injustice serves to correct previous injustices. My mother, a medical doctor, was discriminated against because she was a woman. My wife, a lawyer, was also discriminated against because she was a woman. And now I am told that these injustices will be corrected by discriminating against my sons, who are white males. For those of you keeping score, I have identified 4 types of inconsistency. I would say hypocrisies that are present in contemporary humanities departments in American universities. The inconsistency between justifications given for humanities education and the actual practice, the inconsistency between relativism espoused and the selectivity practiced, inconsistencies in the concept of representation and multiculturalism, and the inconsistency between the underlying theory of affirmative action and its actual application. So my reason I keep going back to Searle, and this is another really important book, The Campus Wars, where Searle talks about this. And one of the things that Searle says is that the problem is not, as Joseph Heath says, that liberals refuse to take their own side in a fight. The problem is that they let themselves get roughshod by the activists. Is that the liberals refuse to stand up and have a spine about liberal values and say, when the activist comes demanding affirmative action, the thing for the liberal to say is, this is unjust. No. The problem is not one of false principles. The problem is one of an inability to have a spine.
Wokal, the moment you say no, you are dissident, right? That is the moment. That is the one single definition that unifies all these different subgroups, is that they're saying no.
I don't think so.
Now, the politically homeless, the left me people, they're not there yet, and they are in the process of questioning their assumptions. But if you follow them to question their assumptions, they eventually come to say, there's something inside of me that saying I'm not going to discriminate and I'm not going to be discriminated against. And yet I'm not ready to stand up for my own interests because I know somehow that that's not polite. It's not nice. And I'm associating with people who go too far in that direction.
I'm willing to stand up. It's not even that I'm not willing to stand up for my own interests. It is that don't construe my interests to be a product of my ethnicity or race. Again, Searle's the one who's telling people to stand up and say no, but he's also saying, I don't want to be thought of in these categories at all.
Yeah.
That's me. And the dissident right has a problem with me because they say, as I am reminded of on the daily, that my interests are actually aligned with the Jews and therefore I can't possibly be on the right. Which I don't know.
Israel is pretty hard right now.
This is the thing, is that you'd think that of all the people that would be on the one society that you'd think they'd want to emulate would be Israel, but no. And why? Jews! We don't like the Jews! And that's part of the underlying anti-Semitism that certain elements of the dissident right have brought in coming out. That's Andrew Torba's influence. But
okay, I
mean, not just Andrew Torba. But
this whole allegation of anti-Semitism, I could just say I could construe the anxiety over white demographic anxiety as a form of anti-whiteness. If I wanted to go down that road, but like using the aegis of anti-Semitism when it helps you,
when I'm then
like letting it be propped up.
When I get told very explicitly, I say, look, I'm a Christian and I'm a white male, so I get it. And they say, you're still Jewish.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
I mean, this is anti-Semitism. Okay. I am not making excuses, nor am I saying that everything is anti-Semitism. I don't think that for example, as far as I know, I don't think that Oron McIntyre is bigoted against Jews. I don't think at all. I don't think actually, and I'd go further, I don't think Oron is bigoted against anybody on the basis of the race. Not that I've seen. Neither is Dave Green. Lots of those people are not. And I don't think I think that a lot of the dissident righties have been unfairly smeared. I think a lot of them have been, and it's not right, it's not fair, and it's not good. What I am saying is that
Very left.
within the dissident right spheres, there is a lot of that is milling about in like the
Yeah.
Ramsey section of the area.
It's really interesting. No, the Fuentes baloney.
Yes, in the Fuentes area.
Should I call it Fedwentes? I don't know.
Well, that guy glows. But the point is, Searle is doing both of these things, and he's a classical liberal. I mean, he's a liberal's liberal in Enlightenment terms. And in the campus war, he talks about the necessity of liberals to have a spine. And one of the things he talks about is the fecklessness of liberals. He says, again, we're going to look for it because it's too good not to read because he's too awesome.
You should just memorize all this stuff. Save us some time, Wokal. But yeah, it just listen. I am the liberals' liberal too. You know, I give overtures. I am becoming a harder and harder critic of liberalism in order to justify my behavior. And my behavior is that I have the capacity to allow other people have different interests and different points of view than me. And I have a natural amount of curiosity and security in myself. I feel like I'm blowing my own tooting my own horn, but liberals rarely do this, to allow somebody to disagree with me and to have their own point of view and not need to correct them or to be proven to be right to them. And I get to display and investigate all these different subcultures respectfully and with a certain amount of neutrality. But at the same time, I understand that liberalism has failed to implement or teach itself to this current generation. Gen X either failed liberalism or liberalism failed Gen X, and we dropped the ball, and the progressive distortion of liberal values has come in and taken over all the institutions. And then Gen X is like, who was too cool for school up to this point, is now decrying the failure of institutions that it itself abandoned because of its ironic apathy. And so I'm of that generation. So I'm not anti-liberal and I'm not illiberal, but I understand that there's certain critiques of it. And without a robust critique engine that is kind of right now found in the dissident right to deconstruct wokeness, I don't see us having a lot of really interesting, dynamic conversations about these questions that we're not supposed to talk about because it runs against the way that the power structures form, without a little bit of noticing. But that noticing goes astray, and I don't really understand what you call the anti-Semitism stuff, which that term just beguiles me because the Hamas are Semites too, so it's just a murky little thing. But anti-Jewish, or this fixation on Jewishness that you see in a lot of right-wing spaces, I think on one level it is a firewall to keep people out of there, to keep all the polite society out of there. But on another level, people are not ironic about it and are just using that as just ways to be really unintelligent. But unintelligence is going to be found everywhere. And I don't know if anybody but the high functioning, intelligent, and pre-moral people can be effective liberals or even effective genteel, the gentry. I only said that because he's reading Searle. I don't expect a reply, but anybody who's listening, feel free to reply in the comments.
What's the old line? That if you don't listen to reasonable men, then the truth will be let to be spoken by unreasonable men.
Yeah, that could be construed as
right. It's. Yeah. I think there's a lot of that in there. Yeah,
well, you got the Steve Saylors and the Charles Murrays, just pointing out different demographic disparities and how if we aren't allowed to talk to them, we're not going to be able to deal with them. And the way we're dealing with them now is ruining society. But you're still not supposed to notice. Now, the Jewish stuff is interesting because that's people that's motivated a lot by pattern recognition of high functioning individuals, and that can just turn into another form of just trying to leak out meritocratic, high competent people from society because they have a certain ethnic background. But that'll work all the way down the line. But you know, at the same time, it's envy and also kind of a little bit of angst that this one portion of society gets to control so much of the knowledge and cultural production. And a lot of that cultural production is, on the face of it, anti-white, which is another problem. And to notice that makes you anti-Semitic, so you're kind of sealed against that. You still Serlin?
There's a certain look. I know the move you're talking about. I'm kind of Serling, but I'm less Serling now than I was. I'm not sure I'm going to find it. I just have to lie on my tummy now. Part of the issue is there's a certain move that gets made in which the progressives seek to use, what would you call it? They seek to take any maneuver that's made to deal with, talk about, or otherwise explore the way that they are, the way that the left is pathologizing white people, or the way that they are engaged in a sort of wink and nudge racialism, or the game that they're playing in race with race. There's a sort of wink and nudge game where they want to, it's like, how can I put it? It's like the great replacement theory. Like they'll talk endlessly about how they desperately want demographic replacement. And then when you say, hey, you guys want demographic replacement, they'll say, look, you're engaging in a very weird conspiracy theory. How could you do that?
Yeah.
Right?
What, are you insecure? Are you insecure? Well, you were just offending me. Oh, stop being defensive, but you're being offensive. Stop being defensive.
That's right.
So I think that the one critique of the dissident right is if they fall for that, which is one of James's big points, is that be careful not to fall for that. But if you don't react to anything, the ratchet continues.
Yes. And I think there is a very serious problem. I don't deny that it's a problem. I don't think what I take issue with is the attempted use of the attempt to deal with that by reconstituting and recreating and bringing back white identity politics as a sort of salve for that.
Well, again, we're in a democracy, and so there has to be interest groups. There will always be interest groups. Now, we can go regional wise, and that might be a safer way of doing that. But as we see, the institutions are so corrupt that it has to be a national or a broader coalition of people kind of speaking to their interests. Now, I don't favor racialization, but it just seems to be a one aspect that has a certain amount of validity in what people actually want, who they're actually attracted to. I made a joke in the middle of 2020 that Pornhub joined the DEI bandwagon and is now promoting a certain percentage of different ethnic porn in order to implement sexual diversity quotas, right? And that's a play on natural attraction.
I don't know whether that's actually true or whether you're just screwing with me right now. No,
that was a joke. That's a joke, but it's plausible. Right. But there is a certain amount of genetic desire, like there's a certain, you're attracted to who you're attracted to.
Yes.
Which isn't just about genital preferences. There are certain, racial aspects to that. So it does have a perpetuating interest. It is a part of our interests, and it's not the end all be all, but it is determinative of a certain thing. It's a determinative of certain values, and those values can transcend race, but in a polity that is formed on group interest, denying, lifting up every other group, ethnic group's interest, and disregarding or actively deriding one ethnic group's interest is going to be met with that ethnic group interest being reconstituted in some way. And so the problem is to reconstitute it in the correct way with the correct amount of weight, but not to deny that it's a factor in a lot of things. Because then you get this white guilt, white power bullshit, and both of those things are the wrong way to constitute whatever this thing called whiteness is. And it can be a really soft form of identity that doesn't determine complete swaths of epistemic understanding or knowledge, but it does have something to do, and it does have a place in our current system.
I think whenever you're forming a group of any kind, I mean, we just readily grasp the word interest group for a reason, right?
Yeah.
We just do it naturally. I mean, every people say, well, we don't. No, we do. We just grab. And it's even a cliche at this point, right? Like, we're at a point now where it's cliche to talk about the problems of, for example, various interests group, or the interests of big pharma, et cetera, right? We talk about this all the time.
Yeah, corporate interests. Yeah.
Corporate interest groups, special interest groups.
Class interest groups.
Yeah, certainly. I am not claiming, and I do not believe that there can't be groups that have interests. But it's one thing to say this group has interests, and it's another to forge an identity, to pull that identity together, attribute a bunch of interests to it. Like, for example, if I'm talking about the interests of children as a group, that's one thing. But I'm not creating a childhood identity and then investing that with a pile of interests, like a bucket, and then using that as the locus of my political activism. Does that make sense?
Well, insofar as it's memeable, it exists on the level of the meme, like the trad wife and the yes guy, right? I mean, those aren't necessarily racialized symbols, but they are both white kind of stereotypes and just form into some sort of based trad kind of cool thing that has a certain valence. So I'm just saying I think that the proper mode of engaging with this particular issue of white identitarian interests is to formulate it correctly within a liberal, that means a free market, that is a good faith, coalition building, collective, and that extends beyond itself, like a harmony between races rather than a colorblind, everybody gets to have a race, but only if you're not the majority.
Colorblind, everyone gets to have a race except if you're the majority.
Yeah. That's basically what the civil rights movement came to. So it's not about deconstructing white identity. It's about saying, okay, it has to have some amount of political agency in order for the white middle class, that is the bread and butter of American society, to thrive. You know, they are the backbone. I'm sorry, demographically speaking, they're the ones who save us from descending into a third world government, globalist agenda nightmarescape, because they have a certain amount of values and they're generally white, and you're allowed to enter into that middle class if you're a variety of races and stuff. But there is a collective interest in that group that is being explicitly called out, and they can use that explicit recalling us, hey, no, we're white and that's fine. And we have a collective interest, but it only determines so much, and we only use it in a certain way. It's not a way to pin some sort of epistemic knowledge or superiority on anything, but it is still a form of collective group interest that is just valid. It's just how things work. Now, maybe things don't have to work that way, but I don't see them not working that way. I see white liberals using their whiteness. They just use it as white guilt. It's the same exact thing, but they're using it in the negative. So it's just like one step removed, and it's incredibly toxic. And it's a way for them to denigrate white people and participate in anti-white racism themselves while excusing themselves for doing that and glorifying themselves in the process. So, I mean, I just don't think we can enter into a post-racialized world at this point, but there's a way to construct racial interests that don't go too far and that open for the possibility of interracial harmony and country building.
Sure. But again, I want to hold on to what Searle had to say and say that if we're going to talk about interests, the broader interest of us all is to not be involved and to not have racial interethnic conflict. Or how do I say this? It seems like adopting a racial identity as step one, and then deriving from that racial identity a set of interests, which you then make the locus of your political ideology, seems to be the wrong way to go. That seems to put the cart before the horse. Right? Like, why would you go about that?
Because explicitly the regime is intentionally agitating and denigrating one racial group.
That's true. I agree with that.
If the Jews didn't band together as Jews, how would they ever defeat so-called anti-Semitism? Like you have to adhere to at some point to your ethnicity in order to protect your ethnicity. When it's embattled. So as long as you're doing defensively, then is it not just justified? If you're doing offensively, then I understand that it's offensive.
Yeah, that's seeing a difference between
this is the most storm-fronty conversation on record.
I think that the issue is that well, first off, yes, the antagonism towards white people is real. And Searle did that out particularly in the universities back in the 90s. That's true. I don't think that creating the white interest group politics writ large is a solution to this. The solution is, again, the destruction of the leftist meta which created it. Because all that's going to happen is if you create a white interest group, the left is going to say, aha, see, there's the thing we told you was there all along.
Yeah.
We got to take care of it.
So it wouldn't be there if you didn't create it. I mean, no, seriously, like, is it not a good solution to say that all racial identity is well, I mean, one, culturally, like not in the political sphere, not in like trying to get power or impose your interests on other people, but there's a kind of an ethnic solidarity that's natural and beautiful in its own kind of multicultural way, but also defensively when under attack. The NAACP, all these African-American associations that were built in defense of the liberty of the blacks that was not being manifested by society at that time, that seems more justified than black power movements or white power movements that are trying to hold on to or impose their interests on other groups by taking something away. So I don't know. Are you saying that all identity is zero-sum? Because then we have to dismantle feminism, we have to dismantle meninism, we have to dismantle every single vector of identity, Or we can construct them in a proper way and then put them within their proper nested realities, like a la Peugeot or Peterson with their whole stacking identity groups or conception of
Well,
stacking identities.
if we're being honest, I kind of do think, like if we're just being totally honest, I, I do think that the vast majority of academic feminism does need to be dismantled. I mean, that was a huge vector of postmodernism. So if you're going to say, well, then we'll have to dismantle feminism, I'm
Okay. So you're at least that based.
like I think, um, I think interest group politics and tribal politics as the vector through which we do politics is, um,
Wayward and not aligned with truth. It's aligned with power. And that is that not the product or the problem of our current system of democracy, which just necessitates group interest, necessitates or requires some sort of identity in order to get things done, and voting blocks and stuff like that. So women's rights, women want particular rights, special rights, because they have particular needs and particular roles in society. And, you know, you can argue against feminism and say they want the cake and eat it too. And that's the case a lot. You know, they want the protections, but they also want they want to, you know, all the affirmative action. And then they want all the special inclusions when it suits them. And they don't want to, you know, to a certain degree, be subject to the requirements that males historically were required to perform, such as, I don't know, the draft or something like that. There's that whole argument. But I don't see you dismantling females as a class interest any more than I see most racial groups just giving up their racial identity and hoping that they're respected and not discriminated against. Especially when we've proven that the system can't maintain neutrality for any extended period of time.
I think that there is a difference between saying that the law needs to take into account the biological differences between males and females on the one hand, and adopting a set of interests based on a socially constructed identity on the other.
Including religious freedoms or religious protections? Religious exemptions, let's say, to fight, to get vaccines, to, you know, eat certain things or do work on certain days.
No, I don't think, I think, how do I put this? I don't think that it should be the religious identity that gets you anything at all, or the religious interests. I think it's a restraint on government that does the work there. A restraint on the power of government that does the work there.
So what if instead of all these races fighting against each other, they fight against the government? Would that be okay?
Again, what is the base on what is the foundation for your interests? Is it your racial or ethnic identity, or is it some other feature of yourself?
It's a desire to freely associate and to live life as you see fit, which does align more or less with ethnic values that differ from society to society, which leads to different proportions of prosperity and lack. But that stuff shakes out.
Again, this strikes me as an attempt to say, I have to think about this a little bit more deeply, and I'm kind of reaching the end of my attention span at the moment. To be honest with you,
that's fine. But you have so much Searle in your head. You got a surly mind. I mean, these are just, I'm stating these questions not because I necessarily agree. I'm not advancing a stance, but this is what I've derived from my investigation of this portion of discourse. And there are problems that you see that I agree to. There's a lot of racism and which I find to be counterproductive, if not, I don't necessarily think dangerous because there's no power there, but it muddies the conversation, and it makes the conversation more difficult to have because people associate the entire conversation to racism rather than some form of realistic grappling with biological, racial, and ethnic and social reality as manifested in the holistic manifestation of human beings as these messy creatures with particularity. So it's interesting. I'm looking for answers. I'm looking for counters to this. And my advance is that it can be done in a liberal way. Liberalism, if it's true, like you said, that liberalism doesn't mean give up all of your interests, then there has to be a place for white identitarianism performed liberally, which I would mean, in good faith and smartly.
No. Racial identitarianism is dead. Racial identitarianism of all kinds is dead.
Okay, well, it's undead because it's still alive and well.
And it should be killed off.
Okay. But it keeps on coming back.
That's because the left continues to summon up demons in order to try and bring it back. You cannot stop people from trying to cash in on the tribalistic nature of human beings.
Well, yeah, but can you kill the tribal? Is it not like a utopian endeavor to kill the tribal nature of human beings? That's like the same thing. It's like it's a social Lysenkoism.
No, it's not social Lysenkoism because how do I put this? You can offer up forms of identity which are non-racial. I mean, racial identity, like you cracked the joke earlier and said, look, you don't want racial wars, you want religious wars. That used to be what we had
in Europe.
Right?
In Europe.
Right, but the way that we build the tribes, or the way that these things are constituted together, doesn't need to be happen along the racial lines. I mean, this is Brett Weinstein on lineage versus lineage, right? And it might be the case that there's a certain amount of lineage versus lineage type of
pressures
that we can in fact rise above. It is the crass cynic who wants to politically monetize those instincts in order to gain power.
Yeah.
And our goal should be to frustrate that, not lean into it.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you can try to abolish the tribal nature of man, or you can try to accept it and then bend it towards your values, which would be harmony between the races and not internecine conflict. But denial of tribal interests formed along visually represented, signifiers, I think is just how do you get away from it? Like, how does the bureaucratic state get away from that? You would have to erase the census that divides people up into these things. You would have to re-engineer so many levels of society in order to really make it truly colorblind, or you can lean into it up to a certain point and then rein it in and direct it in towards harmony rather than conflict.
No, because what'll end up happening is that it'll heighten the conflict. It will further.
Yeah.
That's what will happen. That's the mistake. The mistake is to think that we can avoid that. And no, it won't. It will just create further nation. And I think devastating polarization.
I am such a liberal. I'm such a shit lib that I do think that multicultural, multi-ethnic solidarity is possible. And it doesn't have to be around even fighting against the same thing. It can be fighting for or working towards prosperity. I think you can tether that to a relationship that is mutually beneficial. But as it stands, it's entrenched in a negative zero-sum game. I don't see how you end that without bending it towards the good and then dismantling it after there's no longer conflict and there's no longer this antagonism that's exciting it. But maybe, yeah, so this is my shitlib, civil rights era, 90s Gen X, grew up on Martin Luther King, didn't know he was a communist kind of like way of thinking, so maybe I'm wrong. Pollyanna prevails. I don't know, but you're right. Look, we should wrap it up. I want to know though, for the audience at home, do you have a delicious deluxe book coming down the pike? Do you have a Substack that people can plug into? Where's your product?
I have a book that's coming.
Ooh,
it's not done yet, but it's on its way.
What's the title?
I'm experimenting with a couple.
Okay.
How the World Went Mad,
Ooh.
Breaking the Spell of the Postmodern World.
Mm. So it's the exploration of how postmodernism has poisoned and diluted modernity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a nice way to touch on it. I think that would be a nice start. Anyway, my
Anyway,
brain is tired.
okay. I need to.
I've run out of steam. I apologize.
Okay. So no. Let me wrap up the recording now.
Mhm.
Boom.